The moment Jarek slammed his hand onto the poker table, the saloon fell deathly silent, as though the desert itself had pressed its ear to the wooden boards, listening. Dust swirled in the slanted sunlight streaming through the grimy windows, catching the motes like tiny sparks of gold. The air smelled of sweat, whiskey and old leather, and for a heartbeat. Even the piano player stopped, letting the room's tension press down like a weight no one could lift. Jarek, an Apache warrior with broad, scarred shoulders and eyes black as midnight, leaned back in his chair, the echo of the table slap resonating deep in his chest. His dark hair fell in tangles around his face, sweat streaking against the dust that clung to his skin. Across the table, a grinning gambler revealed his hand 4 aces. Jarek's jaw tightened. He had risked everything, every last coin, and now he was about to pay the price. And the wager? Not gold, not land. Something far more dangerous. From the corner of the saloon, a flash of crimson caught his eye. She was a dancer, one of the finest in the territory, known to make even the most hardened men stop mid-step. Marisol, young, vibrant, 30 years of life burning bright in her green eyes, spun across the floor with a flourish that made her skirts flare like flames. Her laughter rang clear and free, but tonight it carried a note of uncertainty, as if the universe had whispered that her world was about to tilt. The gambler leaned closer, voice low and dripping with mischief. You know the terms, Jarek. Loser doesn't just pay, loser gives up what the winner asks. Jarek's pulse hammered in his ears. He had been reckless, prideful, and drunk on the thrill of the game. And now he was paying for it. He had made the unthinkable bet, the kind whispered about in taverns and around campfires, a wager that could force him to relinquish his freedom in ways he had never imagined. The crowd of miners, cowboys, and townsfolk circled tighter, sensing the stakes. Eyes flickered between Jarek and the gambler. There was a tension that could have been sliced with a knife, an invisible thread straining toward a snap. Jarek's fingers twitched toward his knife, hidden in his boot, but he knew better than to start a fight. This game was about honor as much as chance, and losing honor could be far worse than losing a hand. Finally, the dealer's hands moved with mechanical precision, flipping the last card onto the table. Jarek's stomach sank, and the room exhaled collectively. He had lost. The gambler's grin widened. Looks like the stakes are due, Apache. He leaned back, eyes glinting, then gestured toward the dancer. You, Miss Marisol, will join him as... Agreed. For a heartbeat, Marisol froze mid-spin. Her green eyes widened, catching Jarek's gaze across the room. Shock, fear, defiance, it all mingled on her face, a storm of emotions he had never seen before. He could feel the unspoken words between them. She did not want this, and he did not want it either. But the law of the saloon and the law of the desert was clear. A wager was a vow, and a vow was unbreakable. Jarek rose, chair scraping against the wooden floor, boots heavy on the worn boards. Every movement radiated power, but also restraint. He could crush this gambler and the room with ease, yet he held himself back. He was bound now, bound by pride, honor, and a bet made under the reckless gaze of fate. Marisol's heart raced, and for the first time she saw the man behind the warrior's mask. Not just a fighter, not just a gambler, but someone with depth, shadows, and a flicker of vulnerability hidden beneath his fierce exterior. And though her mouth trembled, her voice refused to falter. I don't, but the gambler cut her off with a mocking bow. I believe you'll find your new companion quite formidable. A cold hush settled over the saloon. Even the piano keys seemed to tremble. Jarek's dark eyes flicked to Marisol once more, an unreadable storm behind them. He stepped closer, the weight of inevitability heavy in each stride. The whispers around them shifted, threads of curiosity, fear, and scandal intertwining like smoke in the air. By the time he reached her, Marisol had stopped spinning, her skirts trailing across the dusty floor. Her eyes locked on his, searching for something, any sign that this forced bond would not destroy her completely. Jarek offered no comfort, only the raw presence of a man caught between fate and freedom, honor and desire. In that moment, the desert winds pressed against the saloon walls, rattling the windows, as if even the land itself knew nothing would ever be the same again. And so began a journey neither of them had chosen, a path that would test courage, defy desire, and reshape the lives of an Apache warrior and a saloon dancer forever. The chapel was little more than a weathered wooden shack perched on the edge of town, sunlight slicing through the gaps in the walls, dust motes drifting like tiny ghosts in the air. The scent of pine, candle wax, and old timber mingled with the faint aroma of Marisol's jasmine perfume, a fragile reminder of normalcy in a world that had suddenly turned cruel. She smoothed the bouquet of wild daisies she had tied in her hair, her fingers trembling. The daisies were delicate, white and yellow, yet even their brightness could not chase away the knot of fear tightening in her chest. Jarek stood at the doorway, his shadow stretching long across the dusty floorboards. Broad-shouldered, scarred, and shirtless under a leather vest thrown loosely over him, he radiated the dangerous magnetism of a man who had lived every day teetering between life and death. Tribal jewelry of turquoise and bone jingled faintly as he shifted, long black hair catching the sunlight streaming in from the cracks above. Every eye in the chapel, miners, cowboys, and curious townsfolk was fixed on him, a mixture of awe, respect, and barely concealed fear in their gazes. Marisol's heart pounded. She had seen him fight, seen him gamble with life and death, and yet here he was, calm, silent, an unyielding presence that made the floorboards feel like they could crumble beneath her. She wanted to look away, to close her eyes, to pretend none of this was happening, but Jarek's dark eyes caught hers across the room. In that instant, she saw something she hadn't expected, an echo of vulnerability beneath the warrior's fierce exterior. A flicker of hesitation, of humanity, or perhaps of recognition that this situation was as unwanted by him as it was by her. The town's preacher, a wiry man with thin spectacles slipping down his nose, cleared his throat nervously. "Are we ready to proceed?" His voice trembled, betraying the absurdity of the ceremony. Marisol swallowed hard, trying to force her racing pulse into a steady rhythm. She glanced down at her hands, clasped tightly together, fingers digging into the lace of her gloves. The weight of the moment pressed down on her like a physical force. This was not just a marriage. It was a sentence, a bond forced by a reckless wager she had no hand in. Jarek's expression remained unreadable. He did not reach for her hand. He did not speak. And yet, every inch of his posture radiated restrained power, a silent warning that while he might be bound by the terms of the bet, he was no one's pawn. Every whisper in the chapel seemed to hang in the air, a delicate tension threading through the room. Marisol could feel it in her bones. This marriage would not be simple. This union would be a clash of wills, a collision of two worlds as different as fire and stone. The preacher hesitated, shuffling his notes. "Do you, Marisol, take this man to be your lawful husband?" His voice cracked slightly, and Marisol's throat tightened. She knew the answer had to be yes, but the words lodged stubbornly in her chest. She looked at Jarek once more. His eyes, fierce and watchful, softened only a fraction, just enough to give her a glimmer of something she could not name. Courage, perhaps, or the faint promise that she would not face this ordeal alone. I do," she whispered finally, voice shaking. The room seemed to exhale. Jarek stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his boots heavy against the creaking wood. He did not take her hand immediately. Instead, he stood close, towering, intense. a living wall of muscle and scarred skin, watching her with that unnerving combination of curiosity and restraint. He spoke, low and measured. "This doesn't mean I wanted this." Marisol's breath caught. His admission, so quiet yet so powerful, pierced the tension. She realized that the man before her was not just a warrior, not just a gambler. He was someone with his own code, his own inner battles, trapped by honor and circumstance just as she was. The revelation was a strange comfort, even as fear still clutched her heart. The preacher muttered the rest of the ceremony, his voice barely audible over the pounding of her pulse. The words blurred, but the meaning was clear. They were bound, by law and by the unbreakable wager, yet already an invisible thread connected them, uneasy, fragile, but undeniable. As Jarek escorted her out of the chapel, the sunlight hit his tribal jewelry, catching turquoise and bone and reflecting off the sweat on his scarred chest. Marisol felt the weight of every eye in town on them, but she also felt something new, a strange, cautious sense of possibility. Perhaps this forced marriage, born of a reckless bet, could lead not only to survival, but to understanding, and maybe, one day, something resembling trust. The wind outside swept dust and whispers across the boardwalk, carrying the scent of the desert, the saloon, and the unknown future waiting just beyond the horizon. The night had fallen like a velvet curtain over the town, the air thick with the scent of horses, wood smoke, and the faint tang of whiskey drifting from the saloon. Jarek and Marisol sat in the quiet of their modest shared room, the silence between them heavier than any storm they had faced outside. The wooden floorboards creaked under their shifting weight, each sound amplified, echoing the unspoken tension that had grown since the forced marriage. Marisol's fingers toyed with the lace at the edge of her nightdress, twisting it nervously as her gaze wandered to the figure across the room. Jarek sat on the edge of the bedroll, broad shoulders hunched slightly, long black hair falling in tangles over his scarred chest. His muscular frame seemed almost too large for the room, yet somehow it filled the space with an undeniable gravity. Tribal jewelry, a necklace of turquoise stones, bone beads, and feathers caught the flickering candlelight, glinting faintly against the sweat and dust on his skin. "I don't understand why this had to happen," Marisol murmured, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, yet the words carried a weight that made Jarek look up sharply. "Neither do I," he admitted, his deep voice rough and low, like gravel rubbing against stone. He paused, studying her carefully, as if weighing the danger of speaking further. "But here we are, and we have to survive it together." Marisol's eyes searched his, seeing not just the warrior who had forced himself into her life through a reckless bet, but a man grappling with his own restraints. There was an intensity in Jarek that made the air between them almost electric, a storm restrained by honor and circumstance. She swallowed hard, realizing that the fear she had felt at the chapel had shifted slightly, no longer pure terror, but a mix of curiosity, wariness, and an unwilling admiration. The night deepened, and outside, the desert wind whispered through the cracks in the walls. It was a reminder that the world beyond this room was harsh, unforgiving, and alive with dangers neither of them could ignore. Marisol took a careful step closer to him, feeling the weight of her own heartbeat echoing in the room. "Do you ever regret being here?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Jarek's dark eyes flicked to the shadows of the room, then back to her. "I regret the bet," he said slowly. "Not you. You're not the enemy. But I don't know how to navigate this situation. I've never been forced to care for someone in this way. Never had to be gentle, when gentleness is a weakness I can't afford." The words struck Marisol. She realized that beneath the warrior's fearsome exterior was a man confronting vulnerabilities he rarely allowed the world to see. And for the first time, she felt a connection, fragile but undeniable, stretching between them. The tension that had once been entirely hostile now carried a strange undercurrent of trust, or at least a cautious willingness to understand each other. Hours passed, marked only by the flicker of candlelight and the occasional creak of the floorboards. They spoke little, but the air shifted. The room no longer felt like a battlefield, but a place where two worlds, wild and disciplined, defiant and wary, could begin to coexist. Jarek occasionally glanced at her, eyes dark yet softened, as if testing the waters of something he had never experienced before. Companionship.Marisol, in turn, felt the tension in her chest ease slightly. She began to understand that Jarek was not just a warrior, a gambler, or a man defined by his bet. He was a protector, fierce and unyielding, yet capable of glimpses of humanity that startled her. She could almost see the weight of his past etched into the lines of his face, the scars that told stories he would never speak aloud. As the candle guttered, casting wavering shadows across the room, Marisol found herself daring to hope. Perhaps this forced union, born of chance and reckless wagers, could lead to something more, something that neither of them had anticipated. Perhaps in the heart of tension and conflict, two unlikely souls could begin to find a rhythm, however tentative, in a world that had never promised them mercy. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, quiet yet alive, a mirror of the uncertainty within the small, dusty room. And inside, the unlikely pair, Jarek, the fierce Apache warrior, and Marisol, the resilient saloon dancer, sat on the edge of a new chapter, their worlds clashing yet beginning, cautiously, to converge. The moon hung low over the town, a pale witness to the events unfolding in the shadows. Streets that had seemed so familiar during the day now twisted and shifted under the ghostly light, the wooden buildings casting jagged, trembling silhouettes. Jarek crouched behind a stack of crates near the general store, muscles coiled like springs, shirtless under the thin leather strap of his vest. His long black hair fell in dark waves over his scarred shoulders, tribal jewelry clinking softly as he shifted his weight. Every breath he drew was controlled, measured, a predator in perfect stillness. Marisol followed closely, her green eyes wide with both fear and exhilaration. She had never imagined herself moving through the night like this, silent and unseen, heart hammering in rhythm with the man beside her. Her crimson skirt had been replaced by practical trousers and a simple blouse, though the faint scent of jasmine clung to her even in the darkness. Tonight, she was no longer just a dancer, no longer just a woman forced into a wagered marriage. She was part of a plan, part of a dangerous game that could determine the safety of the town. "They're unloading the supply wagon," Jarek murmured, voice low like gravel scraping stone. "Stay close. Move only when I move." One wrong sound. His eyes darkened, and he let the threat linger unsaid. Marisol nodded, gripping the edge of the crate, trying to keep her shaking hand still. The gang of outlaws was careless, laughing and cursing as they stacked crates and barrels, unaware of the silent figures watching from the shadows. Jarek's eyes narrowed, reading their positions, calculating distances and timing with the precision of a man who had spent his life in survival. He gestured, a sharp flick of his wrist, and Marisol followed, stepping softly across the gravel, shadowing his movements like a ghost learning from its master. Time stretched, every second heavy with tension. The first misstep, a dropped tin cup, echoed through the alley, and Marisol's heart jumped into her throat. Jarek's hand shot out, pressing a finger to her lips, eyes flashing in warning. The outlaws never noticed, carried away by their own clamor. Jarek struck first, fast and silent. One by one, he disabled the men, using a mix of brute strength and clever leverage, guiding Marisol to act only when necessary. She found herself moving with a rhythm she didn't know she possessed, following his lead, her own fear transforming into adrenaline-fueled determination. Each strike, each step, each whispered command drew them closer together, not just as husband and wife, but as partners in a deadly dance. The last of the outlaws fell, stunned and disoriented, the moonlight glinting off the silver tips of knives discarded in the struggle. Jarek's chest heaved with controlled exertion, his scars and muscles slick with sweat. Marisol pressed her hand to her chest, trying to steady her racing heart, and for the first time she looked at him not with fear, but with awe. He was not just a man who had won a bet, he was a warrior, a protector, a force of nature she could not deny. When the town's supplies were secured, Jarek guided Marisol back to the shadows, his hand brushing hers for a fleeting moment, a silent reassurance. The danger had passed, but the bond forged in the night could not be unseen. "You were amazing," Jarek said quietly, his voice carrying both approval and something softer, almost hesitant. Marisol's cheeks flushed under the moonlight. I couldn't have done it without you," she admitted, realizing in that moment that she no longer viewed him solely as a captor. He was a partner, fierce and unpredictable, but undeniably protective. The wind stirred, carrying dust and whispers through the empty streets, as if the town itself had held its breath during the heist. Jarek and Marisol slipped back to their small home, the weight of the night settling in their muscles and bones. There was no need for words, they both understood the unspoken truth. The danger they had faced together had shifted something between them, subtle but undeniable. Marisol looked up at him, moonlight illuminating the sharp planes of his scarred face and the glint of turquoise and bone beads against his skin. She could see the fierce determination, the pride, and the shadow of something else, a vulnerability reserved only for those who had survived. Alongside him, tonight had been more than survival. It had been a revelation. In the darkness of the town, under the gaze of a silent moon, Marisol and Jarek had begun to navigate the fragile, dangerous threads of trust, courage, and a partnership neither had chosen but could no longer ignore: the desert beyond. Their home whispered promises of more dangers, more trials, and more opportunities for connection. And for the first time since their forced union, Marisol dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could face it together. The saloon was alive with the familiar chaos of the evening, the rattle of poker chips, the clinking of glasses, and the low hum of conversation punctuated by occasional laughter and the sharp twang of the piano. Smoke from the kerosene lamps and burning cigars hung thick in the air, curling like ghosts around the faces of cowboys, miners, and wanderers who had come to drown their worries in whiskey. But for Marisol, tonight's performance was different. Her heart raced with anticipation, and her green eyes constantly flicked toward the doorway where Jarek leaned against the bar, silent, his presence commanding attention without a word. She adjusted her crimson skirt, the fabric catching the lamplight with each swirl as she danced across the worn wooden floor. Every move was precise yet fluid, a reminder that she was not just a dancer, but a master of her craft. But it was Jarek's gaze that held her focus, the way his dark eyes studied her, unblinking, like he was measuring her courage against the strength he knew she possessed. He was muscular, shirtless under the leather vest he refused to remove, tribal jewelry glinting faintly under the dim light turquoise, bone and feathers that marked him as a warrior of the Apache, yet a man of careful restraint when it came to her. The saloon's patrons whispered, stealing glances between Marisol and Jarek. The story of their forced union had spread quickly through the town, and curiosity painted every face. Whispers of the Apache warrior and the saloon dancer wove through the smoke like invisible threads, binding the room in tension. Some men leered, some shook their heads in disbelief, but Jarek's shadow over Marisol kept them all in check. No one dared cross him. Then came the disruption aloud. Drunken gamblers staggered into the center of the floor, mocking Marisol and Jarek alike. "Ha, look at this!" The warrior and the dancer bound by a foolish bet. "What a sight!" he shouted, knocking over a chair for emphasis. The saloon fell silent for a heartbeat, all eyes on the pair. Marisol froze, heart pounding, unsure if she should intervene or retreat into the protective shadow of her husband. Jarek moved first. Every motion was precise, lethal, and controlled. With a swift step, he intercepted the man before he could strike again, his hand gripping the gambler's arm with a strength that made the man wince. The room seemed to hold its breath as Jarek's dark eyes met the drunkard's, unyielding and dangerous. A storm barely contained beneath the calm exterior. "Enough," Jarek's voice rumbled like distant thunder, low but unmistakably commanding. The gambler stammered, realizing the futility of resistance. Chairs splintered and a few bystanders jumped back as the man was quickly subdued, more out of intimidation than brute force. Marisol watched, a mix of fear and awe tightening her chest. He had protected her again not just as a husband, but as a warrior whose loyalty could not be shaken. As the saloon's chaos resumed around them, Jarek stepped aside, his dark hair falling into his eyes, and gestured for Marisol to continue her performance. She hesitated, then allowed herself to spin across the floor again, the crimson of her skirt flashing like fire, drawing the audience back into her rhythm. But this time, she was no longer dancing for mere applause. She was dancing for herself, for the strange, complicated bond that had begun to form between her and Jarek. Later, when the crowd thinned and the saloon settled into quiet murmurs, Marisol approached Jarek. The scent of whiskey and dust clung to him, but beneath it she could sense something else, a fierceness that protected, a loyalty she had not expected to find. "You were amazing tonight," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Jarek's eyes softened, just slightly, the tension in his jaw easing. "You held your own too," he replied, voice low, carrying both approval and the faintest trace of something like pride. They stood together amid the fading smoke and shadows, the saloon alive with whispers and curiosity, but between them a silent understanding had solidified. Tonight had been more than survival, more than mere performance. It had been a lesson in trust, courage, and the beginnings of a partnership neither had sought but could no longer deny. Outside, the desert wind pressed against the saloon's walls, carrying the scent of sand, sage, and possibility. Marisol realized that life with Jarek, though forced into being by a reckless bet, was shaping into something neither predictable nor simple. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, together, they could navigate the dangerous, unpredictable currents of the Old West and perhaps even carve a path of their own choosing. The desert stretched endlessly beyond the town, silvered under the pale light of the rising moon. Jarek led the way, every muscle taut, his shirtless torso gleaming with sweat and dust, long black hair whipping in the cool night wind. Tribal jewelry of turquoise, bone, and feathers jingled softly with each careful step. Marisol followed closely, her heart hammering, legs stiff from the day's events, but determination burning in her green eyes. They were not running for sport. They were tracking a group of thieves who had been raiding local ranches, and the safety of the town depended on them. "Stay close," Jarek murmured, voice low and commanding, a warning carried in the wind. "They won't hesitate if they spot us," Marisol nodded, gripping the leather strap of her satchel tightly, which carried a few essential tools she had learned to wield in moments of necessity. Her crimson scarf, usually used for dance performances, was tied around her wrist as a makeshift signal. The desert was silent except for the faint scuff of boots against sand and the distant call of a coyote. The shadows cast by the jagged rocks ahead stretched like long fingers, hiding dangers in every crevice. Suddenly, a faint movement caught Marisol's attention. Jarek froze instantly, muscles coiled like springs, eyes scanning the darkness. She followed his gaze and saw the glint of metal, a rifle barrel catching moonlight from behind a boulder. The thieves had set a trap. Jarek signaled for her to duck. In a swift, fluid motion, he moved forward, stepping into the open with the confidence of a predator, and threw a rock to the side, drawing their attention. Shots rang out, the desert air erupting with fire and sound. Marisol felt the heat brush her face as a bullet hit a nearby rock, spraying sand and small stones. Her pulse raced, but she remained crouched, trusting the man she had once feared and was beginning to understand in ways words could not capture. Jarek's movements were precise and deadly. He struck quickly, disabling one of the thieves with a well-aimed blow and spinning to intercept another. His strength, agility, and instincts were awe-inspiring, yet there was a rhythm to his action, a strategy that made every move seem almost choreographed. Marisol found herself stepping into the flow, using the distraction he created to slip behind cover, unfasten the thief's supplies, and tie their hands with rope. Time stretched in long, tension-filled moments. Each echo of a shot, each shout, each rustle of sand seemed amplified in the still desert night. Marisol's fear was tempered by adrenaline and the strange comfort of having Jarek beside her, his presence both shield and signal, guiding her through the chaos without a word. Finally, the remaining thieves scattered into the darkness, realizing they had been outmatched. Jarek exhaled, chest rising and falling with exertion, eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. Marisol approached, brushing sand and dust from her trousers, her pulse slowly returning to a steady rhythm. "You are incredible," she said, voice trembling slightly, a mixture of awe and relief. Jarek's dark eyes softened for the briefest moment. "You held your own," he replied, the faintest shadow of a smile playing on his lips. "This isn't just about surviving, Marisol. It's about understanding each other and trusting that we can face anything together." Marisol looked at him, at the powerful frame of the man who had saved her so many times in ways both physical and emotional. His scars, muscles, and tribal jewelry caught the moonlight, but what held her attention was the quiet strength, the unwavering focus, and the rare vulnerability that flickered in his eyes. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and sand, brushing past them as they began the long walk back to town. Each step was heavy with exhaustion, yet lightened by the bond that had deepened in the shadows of danger. The night had tested them, challenged them, and revealed the truth. Their connection was more than circumstance. It was forged in survival, in courage, and in the unspoken understanding that they were stronger together than apart. As the town's lights glimmered in the distance, Marisol allowed herself a rare moment of hope. Perhaps this forced marriage, born of a reckless bet, was slowly transforming into something neither of them had expected, a partnership of trust, strength, and a spark of something neither fully understood yet could not deny. And in the quiet, moonlit desert, Jarek and Marisol continued side by side, ready to face whatever the Old West would throw at them next. The first light of dawn spilled over the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Jarek stood at the edge of the town, his muscular, shirtless frame silhouetted against the awakening sky. Tribal jewelry of turquoise, bone, and feathers gleamed faintly in the morning light, catching dust and sweat from the previous night's desert pursuit. His dark eyes scanned the horizon with a warrior's precision, alert for any sign of danger. Beside him, Marisol adjusted the strap of her satchel, heart racing yet steady with the confidence that had grown between them over the past days. Their task was far from complete. The bandits who had threatened the town and its people were regrouping near the canyon's edge, plotting to strike again. This final confrontation would decide not just the safety of the townsfolk, but the fate of their fragile bond. "Stay close," Jarek murmured, voice low and commanding, his gaze never leaving the distant shadows. Marisol nodded, stepping carefully over rocks and sand, the wind tugging at her hair. She felt the pulse of the desert beneath her boots, felt the rhythm of survival echoing in every heartbeat. She had come to trust Jarek implicitly, relying on his instincts and strength while discovering her own courage in the process. The canyon ahead loomed like a jagged maw, the shadows of rocks and mesas twisting under the morning light. Movement stirred among the rocks, figures creeping with dangerous intent. Jarek signaled silently, crouching low. Every muscle in his body coiled, his dark eyes calculating distances and angles, every detail memorized in a predator's mind. Marisol mirrored him, crouched behind a boulder, breathing steady but alert. The confrontation erupted with sudden violence. Jarek moved like a force of nature, swift and decisive. His fist struck a bandit with unerring precision, sending him sprawling, while Marisol, following his cues, used the satchel strap to trip another. Dust and sand flew in every direction, the sound of struggle echoing through the canyon. Jarek's movements were a blur of strength and strategy, his tribal jewelry clinking faintly with each motion. An extension of the warrior he was. Marisol, heart-pounding but controlled, found herself acting with a newfound confidence. She ducked, rolled, and struck with improvised tools, every action guided by the silent rhythm established with Jarek. They moved as one husband and wife by fate, partners by necessity, warriors united by trust. The last bandit fell, defeated and disoriented, his plans scattered like the sand around him. Jarek breathed deeply, the exertion evident in the rise and fall of his chest, muscles glistening with sweat. Marisol approached, brushing dirt from her trousers, eyes wide but shining with relief and exhilaration. "You've changed things," she said softly, voice trembling slightly. "Not just the town, but us." Jarek's dark eyes softened, the fierceness tempered by something more profound. "We changed each other," he replied. "What began as a forced wager has become a choice, not of circumstance but of trust." Marisol stepped closer, feeling the warmth of his presence and the weight of the journey they had endured. The desert wind stirred, carrying with it the scent of sage, dust, and freedom. For the first time, their union felt like something more than survival. It was a partnership, fragile yet unbreakable, forged in danger, strengthened by courage, and tempered by understanding. They stood together at the edge of the canyon, the sun cresting the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched into the town they had saved. Marisol looked at Jarek, his scarred chest and tribal jewelry glinting in the morning light, and felt a sense of awe and gratitude she had never known. The fear and resentment of their forced marriage had transformed into respect, trust, and an unspoken bond that could withstand even the harshest trials of the Old West. For the first time since the wager that had bound them, she dared to hope. The desert stretched endlessly, full of unknown dangers and possibilities, yet she no longer felt alone. Jarek's presence was a constant reassurance, a promise of protection and strength. And in the quiet of dawn, with the town safe and their bond solidified, Marisol realized that life, even when born from recklessness, could lead to something extraordinary. The wind whispered through the canyon as they turned back toward the town, side by side. Two lives, once forced together by chance, now walked together by choice. The journey had been perilous, the trials relentless, but the connection they had forged was unshakable. And in the rising sun, Jarek and Marisol stepped into the new day, ready to face whatever the Old West had yet to throw at them together.